Okay, hi, welcome everybody to our Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics talk. Treats are a short 20 to 40-minute introduction into various topics in research ethics with an open Q&A session at the end. These talks are held bi-monthly and are recorded and uploaded onto our website as a resource for researchers. My name is Nicholas Oliver, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Andrew O. Brightman. He is a professor of engineering practice in the Weldon School of Biomedical Engineering at Purdue University. Professor Brightman attended North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he received a Bachelor of Science degree in botany and plant physiology. He then went on to receive a PhD in cellular biology and biochemistry at Purdue University. He's long been a BSAP faculty member representing the Bioethics and Subject Advocacy Program at the Purdue University campus and helping to connect researchers there to the resources of the Indiana CTSI. Today, he'll be presenting on the ethics of using medical students as subjects in human subjects research.
Thank you, Nick. That was a great introduction. Yeah, I am happy to be able to participate in the BSAP program, and the talk today on medical students as research subjects seems particularly appropriate as we're wrapping up a semester here at Purdue, and I know in Indianapolis as well. The end of the semester is coming, and many of us are thinking about students and grades and final exams. But this question is about medical students and their role as research participants. I'm going to talk about a little bit of data. Let's make sure I can change these slides here at the beginning. I'm going to talk a little bit of data about medical students as research subjects, participants. What, if any, special considerations are needed for medical students? And that's a question I want us to be thinking about throughout. And I'll give some ethics guidance from a couple of sources, and then we can have a Q&A at the end. I'm going to try to keep this short. Nick, you set a really great standard on your last talk. I appreciated that, and I'll try to do the same, but I don't think I'll be quite as successful. So this was a really recent study. It's the only one I found that actually looked at medical students and the frequency of requests they were receiving in during their training for research and evaluation studies. So this was a study. It happened a large medical hospital in New Zealand. It's a program where the students are in a 6-year program of training, and so this was evaluation of year 2 and year 3 of their preclinical studies. So not the first-year students, but second and third year of their 6 years. They had a response rate of about 28%, so 167 total students in those two cohorts. They have about 300 students per class, per cohort. And so what they found was in 1 year, the cohorts received 42 and 34 respectively program evaluation requests, and 8 and 10 research study requests respectively. They also looked at how the students felt about the number of requests they were getting and their participation level. And generally, the students, 70% felt they were receiving too many program evaluation requests during the year. They thought 76 said they should be restricted on how many they have access, or how many evaluation requests researchers have access to send. And 30% indicated that when they received program evaluation requests, it was a little stressful. Here's the data that shows in both cases, year 2 cohort and year 3 cohort, the evaluation requests were coming in spread throughout the year, but heavily at the beginning of their semesters, February, March, and September, October. The research requests were spread a little more evenly, and certainly much fewer, but still maybe 1 or 2 a month for research requests that the students were receiving. The students did view research requests quite differently than the program evaluation requests. They were more likely to engage with research studies, and that could be academic or clinical research studies. 44% of participation in these two cohorts and compared to 27% participation in the program evaluations. 23% of the students said they didn't have any interest in engaging with the program evaluations, as compared to only 6% said they didn't have interest in the research requests. And that will come up later when we think about how medical students perceive research generally. As said before, the students received too many, their view was they received too many program evaluation requests, which 30 or 40 a year does seem excessive to me as well, compared to the research requests, about 1 a month or 8 to 10 a year. The students were much more likely to rate their first reaction to an evaluation request as stressful than compared to a research request, 31 to 20% for research, respectively. So, do we need special considerations for medical students? I think there's 3 things we can talk about. One is medical students are an accessible, convenient human subjects research population. As we saw in this at least one study, students are available, easily contacted. They are there for a period of time, and this faculty researchers have access to them. Second, though, we need to think that students are a vulnerable human subjects research population due to their being in a training program, due to the faculty-student relationships and their professional development. We'll talk more about that next. And then finally, I'll come back to this idea that students actually can benefit benefit the research and benefit from participation. And we'll talk about some of the positives and potential negatives of their participation. So considering medical students as a vulnerable population, in the 1998 publication Beyond Consent Seeking Justice, there's a big section on vulnerable populations and the challenges as research subjects. It's necessary sometimes in clinical research, because it's complex, expensive, and highly valued social activity, to have a convenient, accessible recruitment population and a group that you can monitor throughout the course of a study. It simply makes clinical research as well as academic research more feasible. And certainly academic research that's posed around medical training seems to need to evaluate based on the medical students. But medical students do occupy this middle ground in vulnerability between, for example, short-term hospitalized patients who are constrained by their hospitalization, and this sort of extreme case example of long-term prisoners and the vulnerability of those who are subject to limited autonomy and agency because of their relationship to the researchers. Among the ways that students do differ from general adult population is, of course, their availability and the greater likelihood that they could be coerced, particularly by faculty researchers, and manipulated into participation. So we also recognize that medical students, because of their professional training, they have a sense of responsibility to participate in research. They recognize as part of their training that research underlies a lot of progress in medical practice. They also understand that because of that, they're going to be more willing to participate in surveys, research studies that don't have significant research, no more than minimal research risk. But because they are first and foremost students, learners, trainees, there is a consensus that it's important to protect their role and their priorities as learners. And some schools, to ensure that the students can prioritize their time for coursework, they require an additional review by an associate dean of medical education for any protocol seeking to recruit medical students. And we'll talk about, I'd like to come back to this, is that it seems only a few schools do this. I haven't done a thorough study, but you'll see a little data further on that is this necessary or is it extra? So medical students certainly can benefit from participating in research. They understand research better if they're part of participation, if they've experienced it firsthand, and they understand some of the challenges as well as the role in improving medicine. Particularly for academic training research, students can benefit their own education from going through a study. One study referenced here, Stevenson et al., I have the references at the end slide, was a study of endoscopic skill and a training innovation, and they used groups of students and also residents and compared them in different scenarios and found that there was a significant improvement because of their intervention. So medical training in that particular field, as is done very often for studies of medical practice, can really be improved, and future medical training can be improved if students participate. If they don't participate, it's harder to judge what the impact of that intervention might be. It also benefits the students' understanding of distinctions between clinical research, biomedical research, academic or basic research, and academic research. And they may then choose to participate differently in the future, more positively as they've had experiences, or support research as they progress professionally into roles where they may have approval or participation possibilities. So certainly a benefit for the students. The students actually could benefit the research as well. As I mentioned, if you're studying academic training practices, working with students seems essential. But medical education and training certainly their medical education and training certainly can increase their understanding of the risk or the consent practices in the research, so they are a more informed group of participants. They also may comply, have increased compliance with the research protocols because of their medical training and their sense of professionalism. So those are both benefits to the study. However, one of the things that came out of the research that's been done on student participation is that participation fatigue and general overall stress of the medical students may in fact reduce their compliance or increase even a dropout rate from studies. They're just too busy, too tired, or have other priorities. So the question that I'm raising today, and maybe we can talk about more at the end, but you certainly can interrupt me at any point here. I'd love to think, do medical students need additional or special protections over and above what generally IRB, human subject research reviews consider for adult general population? Anybody want to chime in with a thought on that? The study I'm referencing here from 1985 was an interesting report from Harvard Medical School. The author was, I think, a second-year medical student representing the student population, and they were complaining that the protections that Harvard Medical School had had in place for the last something like 25 years were actually harmful to the students, even though they were intended to protect them. So here's some of the things that the students were complaining about. The early requirements that were in place were so restrictive as to prevent most of the research, the faculty researchers' studies from using students. So they had to go through multiple reviews and other things to even get access to the students. In most cases, there was a double review required, both by the medical school administration as well as by the study site hospital IRB. The students were given a policy statement at the beginning of the year about participation, which appeared to be quite negative about their enrollment or participation. Another issue was the students' health and well-being were considered high priorities in addition to their time constraints, to the point where many of the studies required the students to have a special medical exam before they could participate in any research. And then payment for participation was primarily restricted They felt it was too coercive because of the large debt of most medical students. So the changes that they were suggesting from the students' view was to eliminate this perceived paternalistic attitude from these policies, to eliminate the double standard review of protocols, and treat medical students as responsible, autonomous adults and utilize the same standards for review as with all adult populations. So that was their perspective. That was back in '85, and certain changes were implemented at that point. And I was curious to know what IU School of Medicine was doing currently. The guidance that I was able to find about student participation was fairly simple. There's 4 points. Recruitment of students into a study by their instructor has the potential to be coercive. That's their understanding, I think agreed upon. And for this reason, teachers should not use their own students as subjects of research if it can be avoided. So use students who are not in your classes. If researchers do wish or need to enroll their own students in research projects, studies, the participation involves students doing something extracurricular to their activities. The researcher is required by the School of Medicine to obtain permission from the students, and additional steps should be taken to prevent students from feeling coerced into participation. And there's not a lot more detail about that, but there are 2 more pieces. One is researchers should arrange to have permissions and data collection, and I think recruitment as well, done in such a way as they will not know if a student is participating, and will not have access to the data about participation or outcomes until grades have been entered. And finally, if course credit is offered in exchange for participation, an alternate means of earning equivalent credit for equal time effort should be made available to all the students subjects. So these alternatives must be carefully reviewed to make sure students are not being coerced into becoming subjects. So a lot of emphasis from this guidance on coercion as the primary problem that students are subject to extra considerations. So question is, are these protections sufficient for medical students to participate in research? Anybody want to add a thought here? I have a few more tips and guidances to come, but I'm just curious if anyone's got questions or thoughts at this stage. If not, that's fine.
I do.
Okay, Peter?
I mean, I will say I think these sound reasonable. I know Nick Christakis. That's interesting that he wrote that paper. He was very young then. He was, I think, a undergraduate. But anyway, I'll figure that out. It's another time. But you know, these are nice requirements. I know you titled your talk "Medical Students Being Used in Research," but as I think you know better than I do, being at Purdue, not so much having medical students as much as other sorts of students. There are fields where student participation in research is very common and often as part of course credit. And that's where I think some of these concerns are raised about you know, coercion, in that, you know, if your professor wants you to participate, then you kind of have to if you want to do well in the class. And these seem like reasonable restrictions to try to keep that from being either implied or reality. So I like them from the starting. I'm not crazy about the limits on paying medical students, as you know, we've talked before on this group about, you know, whether paying well is coercive, even for poor medical students. I'm sort of on the side that's not coercive to pay well, but certainly to withhold grade or make it feel like your grade is going to be dependent on doing research. But I'll stop there. That's just, since you asked for comment, you know, you'll never get me. I'll never pass that. You know, anybody. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Anyone else want to chime in?
I guess this is, as a medical student, I find this very interesting, thinking about, I don't feel like outside of like, yeah, if my grade would be in jeopardy, I don't feel like I need extra protection in terms of research. I mean, quite honestly, sometimes it can get annoying if we get a bunch of emails about studies, but I'm like, yeah, so what? Like, you're in a setting that's easy to recruit from. Like, it kind of makes sense to me. If anything, like, part of me is like, as a researcher, what is it going to take to like actually help recruit medical students when you get so many, as a medical student, like get so many requests for studies. And I think like, not only like, and my brain doesn't even think about like how to not be coercive, but how to actually make your study more appealing to medical students to want to participate, like kind of like the exact opposite of the question that you're mostly raising here. But like, I don't feel like I need extra protections. I don't feel like I'm more vulnerable than somebody else, other than the fact, like, I guess because of grades, but I don't think I've ever had that concern when seeing a study come through my email.
Thank you, Clayton. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that we can keep thinking about. Peter, you raised the question about payment. I didn't find any other research, particularly around payment. So that was an interesting, back in the 80s, I guess, there were some problems with payment issues. But maybe that's been largely resolved. And this idea that I think the key thing that people are considering is it just a convenient population, or is it the right population to study? And it clearly depends on the research. Clayton, your point of targeting medical students because they're the right population and making it clear that they should participate. Because if you get 10 requests or 5 requests a year, how do you decide which ones to prioritize? And if it's just because you're hanging around, you're available, or is it because it may actually make a big difference to have a medical student participate? I think are key ideas. And my participation in IRBs and overseeing student as subjects, those questions aren't typically considered at all. It's just, considering students as potentially coerced and but otherwise as adults. So yeah, so another set of guidance, though, recently I discovered this. This is the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. They have 8 points of guidance that I wanted to address, and some of them are a little more restrictive. So they recognize the heavy curriculum burden on medical students, and so they actually have developed specific policy for enrollment into research protocols. They have a research on medical students review committee that requires the review the protocol before it can be submitted to an IRB. So they're doing the double review. Their additional review goal is to balance the needs of the researchers with interest and availability of medical students. So maybe they're asking that sort of question: is this really about medical students, or is it just convenient because you have all their emails or you have a way to contact them? Their advice or requirement is a medical student may not be required to participate in research for course credit. So embedding the research into a course and not giving the students an opt-out is not allowed. But if you make it optional extra credit, you have to have the comparable non-research alternative similar to IU School of Medicine. To minimize that potential for coercion, which seems to be the biggest issue to consider, then the alternative to research for credit must be equivalent in time, effort, and fulfillment, right? You can't say, well, you can do other research, or you can write a 25-page research paper on some topic you're unfamiliar with. That's not equivalent time or effort or fulfillment. So I think that's the hardest one, having done a number of studies with students, is to make alternatives that seem equivalent in terms of time, effort, requirement, fulfillment, and student learning, right? Because students learn from participation in research. Can you create something, an alternative that they can equally benefit from learning and participation? They emphasize that students must be free to withdraw from participation at any point. And I think every IRB will re-emphasize this point, as with any human subjects adult population. They have to be able to withdraw from the participation, particularly if it's a course without penalty. And that means they get full credit for participation, even if they enroll and only complete part of the study. Which is sometimes hard for investigators to deal with. Recruitment must be designed to minimize possibility of undue influence. So recruiting from a broad base of individuals rather than from your own class or from personal solicitation of specific students. Those are generally seen as more coercive. And finally, investigators should not enroll students from their own classes when the research involves greater than minimal risk, particularly without the prospect of direct benefit to those students. So that's University of Pittsburgh Medical School. There are 8 special requirements for enrolling their medical students. An additional set of 12 recommendations that I think are similar but useful to consider. This was a 2018 paper from Canada on medical student enrollment in primarily academic research projects, because it seems to be the majority of where students are enrolled. And I think these are some good tips to keep in mind if you ever want to do a study with students. Is first determine if the study is a program evaluation or an actual research project, because the oversight requirements, the consent requirements are different. The difference there, if it's human subjects research, that's typically generalizable data that is required to be generalizable data that's going to be published in a widespread dissemination, whereas a program evaluation is for local use only, and the data is specific to the scenario of the study of the program. It's important to verify if you're going to use secondary data, secondary use of data that's already been collected. Verify if you need to get consent from the students. So if you collected some data in a course already and you want to do a research project on it, in most cases, if it's de-identified or anonymized, consent is not needed. But sometimes FERPA requirements, because it's in an educational setting, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act requires instructors to get consent for student data to be used, but that needs to be verified. You certainly want to inform the students of all the privacy and consent measures that your research involves. You want them to understand what you're doing to reduce any potential for coercion, and also for biased responses. You certainly don't want your data to be impacted by students who are just telling you what you want to hear because they think you'll give them a good grade. That kind of ruins the point of the study. So detailed information, informed consent about privacy, about consent practices. And that involves typically consent by an independent team member rather than the faculty member themselves. Even if it's not your class specifically, if you're a faculty member, a standard of practice is to find a third party to do recruitment and consent. So there's less conflict of interest and coercion. There's even research project recruitment management for participants, software programs that will do this electronically, separate from the researchers that a member of the research team can run. I actually haven't worked with any of that. I don't know if anybody knows any good programs, but you want to have a well-established and verified program if you're going to use one of those. But that's a good tip for making independent recruitment and consent practice. Tip 5 is ensure the participation remains confidential throughout the study. So particularly if it's longitudinal studies, if the cohort starts to decrease and they're becoming more professionally trained or advancing in your program, in the training, it may get harder and harder to keep the data de-identified or anonymous. So you have to think about that, particularly for longitudinal studies. In any case, you want to limit personal data collection to the minimum required for the study, anonymize the data if possible, and or de-identify it if you still need to have it linked to a code before it's released to the research team, and to keep it that way, again, with third-party de-identification if possible. This is important as you're dealing with different kinds of data, but protect against any possible re-identification of data. So again, with smaller cohorts, strict inclusion criteria, it may become possible once that data is ready for publication for someone to trace back based on gender or based on the training site. If that's included in there and the cohort size and the year, then it may become possible to re-identify certain participants, individuals. And you want to protect against possible unauthorized access. So data security, particularly digital data that's being collected. Data breaches really erode trust in research, not just in the individual researcher, but in the whole research paradigm and process, so that you get less participation if people don't feel their data can be protected. The last four are: avoid making any research study part of mandatory training. So this sort of is, if you implement an intervention that's mandatory before you, and then you do the study on it, you're sort of avoiding full consent, and it actually may prove to be a harmful intervention to some who don't have the option to withdraw or to not participate. This is an important one, I thought, considering using breaks in mandatory training schedule. So if you're working with medical students and you find out their training schedule and they have a 2-week off break, and you can give them a chance to participate in some study at that point, it certainly reduces their stress and increases their possibility of participation. So that could be an efficient way to run a study if it's possible to do it on that time frame. Certainly avoiding course credit for participation is a general practice that is best practice. Offering course credit complicates consent, coercion, and selection bias. The thing that I think researchers don't think about is, oh, I'm going to offer it as extra credit. Well, often then the cohort that decides to do it are either those who really are struggling and need the extra credit, or those who are just looking for a good grade and not really interested in the research. So you could get some selection bias there. And finally, a review by an educational research committee, even though those committees seem to be rare now. One study recently of the top medical, 4 top medical education journals indicated that only 5% of research studies had been reviewed by an education research committee. These are academic research versus clinical research. But those kinds of reviews could supplement what's being done by an IRB, IRBs often expedite educational research and don't do the deeper dive on human subjects research, considering these constraints of medical students. So that's the data that I have, pretty close to 30 minutes. How's that, Peter? But I want to open it up just to see if people have any more thoughts about thinking about special considerations for medical students or any students, as we've looked at as research participants. Do we need special considerations? Yes, no, maybe, IRBs. Okay, Nick, go ahead.
Sure. This was actually just on your previous slide. You said that only 5% of these studies were reviewed by an academic review board, and that the IRBs usually just expedite this. Are you saying that IRBs should ostensibly take a closer look at these studies, or are somehow failing the subjects in some way?
I wouldn't say they're failing the subjects. And I have very limited IRB review, but I've participated in IRB review of education. I'm talking about academic research on with students and student populations. I do think that medical students, or I would say any students who are in a specific cohort training program, may have some special considerations versus a study that looks at all university students or is open to, all students who are in a, liberal arts program. And I don't think, I haven't seen IRB review asking questions about that kind of coercion, other than just the standard, is the student in your classroom, kind of, how are you protecting the researchers from knowing who's participating? So I'm not accusing the IRB of undue limited review, but a lot of those studies do get expedited review and maybe are missing some things. just wanted to be provocative.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead, Clayton. I think, no, it's Colin. Sorry.
So thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm really interested in especially the boundary between the kind of QI, like course improvement type projects, which I do every year with all of my teaching, but have no intention of publishing. But the thing that I'm really interested in, that's kind of my question / comment for you, is about privacy, which I was happy to hear you bring up. And I think it's also related to what you were just saying about the distinction between kind of more specialized training, levels of training, and then these really broad school-wide studies. When I was in grad school, I participated in a study, and I will say it wasn't coercive, but the money was 100% the reason that I was willing to do it. And it was just an interview study with some sociologists on campus, but they asked pretty pointed questions about our experience as a cohort, and it was all about networking. And then my cohort was 11 people. They were doing it at a few different sites, but they were all sites that were equally small cohorts. And for me, it completely prevented me from saying a lot of things that I would say because I knew that there was no way they'd actually be able to anonymize it. They like consistently reassured me that they would, but then as soon as their first publication came out, the very first quote was from someone. I forget exactly how they disclosed it, but they even said something like, I think they even said which campus it was from. They said that the participant was a male. And the quote was something about playing D&D with friends over the internet. And I'm like, well, that can be only one person in my cohort, you know? And then they gave a pseudonym. And so then you can just track every single thing this person said throughout the entire paper. And I wanted to flag that both because I think it's important for the participants. Like this person didn't care, luckily, that their comments were so identifiable, but you could certainly imagine that that could be a problem. They did go on to say that, like, talk about being depressed and stuff like that, kind of sensitive stuff. But on the other hand, like on my side of the story, how damaging it can be to the data that you're collecting, even if you're trying to make these guarantees at that kind of a level, and the way that that plays into the hierarchy of educational settings.
Colin, thank you for raising that. I wish I could have found more actual research on that topic because I've seen it in my own research, and the only comment that I saw in the papers I was reading was that that was reaffirming that students often consider some of their information as more personal, sensitive, or embarrassing than the researchers might. You know, so maybe somebody doesn't want other people to know they played D&D, right, with their friends, or maybe they're in a professional training program and they don't want people to know other issues about them that, you know, maybe are publicly acceptable, but not in that context. So this idea of anonymizing or de-identifying is problematic. I've on several of my research teams, when we're collecting smaller student cohorts, you know, something that's closer to 25 or 30, even if they're drawn from different groups, as you said, you know, maybe multiple sites, how do we de-identify? And yet, particularly if it's a qualitative study, how do we then present the data so it's not re-identifiable? So things like mixing genders, mixing names, not using names, because sometimes names are, we've started using pseudonyms that are not identifiable male or female gendered names in the population, because sometimes we have, you know, in engineering particularly, we may have a cohort with, we try to get equal genders, but we're often skewed very heavily in one way, as you might imagine. So, and then not identifying which cohort they're in, certainly, as you said, not identifying a campus or a class or a group that they're from, because re-identification becomes so much more easy, particularly for students who are participating in that. And so the data gets skewed if they don't know that you've done all your homework to protect them and protect their responses. So you're absolutely right. It's both the human subjects protection, but you want to look at how that both selection bias on the front end and then response bias is going to be impacted by your ability to anonymize the data, anonymize the recruitment participation. So I don't see enough research on that. So maybe that's a project that you know more about. Maybe you are doing some research in that area. I don't know, Colin, but I'd love to see more there.
May I thank you first of all very much indeed for the presentation. Going back to the University of Pittsburgh, this sort of oversight committee that supposedly protects the students based on the commitments they have and so on and so forth. And it sort of also touches sort of inversely on the, as we all know, everyone's right to withdraw from a study for whatever reason without prejudice and so on. But one thing that occurs to me, perhaps this oversight committee, if it has a gatekeeper responsibility, perhaps it actually discriminates against individual students who might want to participate in the study, even though the committee decides that overall, for example, it's too demanding of time. But we all know everyone is different, and some students may say, look, I can do this, I'd like to do this, but the committee isn't allowing me to do this.
Indeed, that I think was the argument that the 1985 paper, the students at Harvard Medical School were saying, you can't lump us all together into one group as medical students. We have very different life circumstances, experience, capabilities, and it does seem overly controlling, paternalistic, gatekeeping for an additional review with such stringent requirements. At the same time, I might argue that an educational review committee might think of the students in some ways that a standard clinical IRB would not. And so I think you want to find a balance between those two and not go in the direction you're mentioning, I agree, of being overly restrictive so that students who would gain a great deal and the research would gain a great deal from their participation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. But
what's interesting, Andrew, is also, this general question, right, of balancing the protection of subjects against the advance of science. And I think these issues come up here, like you were saying about the medical students. How much protection do they need versus how much paternalism can we stand, right? I appreciate that balance there. You even brought it up also in terms of whether there should be an additional review of, potentially minimal risk research, which maybe would be a appreciated source of income for a medical student, and say, well, this isn't a very good study or something. Or like Colin was saying, we do lots of, classroom evaluation, which it seems very, I'm going to say it seems whiny on my part for the medical students to say, we don't like being asked if our classes are good. Like, well, I don't really care if you like it. It's really not about research. It's about improving your curriculum. Maybe it'll be published, so it's research, maybe it's not. So I really love these topics that you've raised. I love how you did it. Can I ask a question? So you said you have done research with your students. So are you talking to, because those who don't know Andrew, he does device research. So he's talking about implanting defibrillators in his students. But I assume it wasn't that. I assume it was some guy like temperature gauge on their skin or something. What sort of research are we talking, and what sort of issues did you face, if you don't mind my asking?
Yeah. So my research team in the last decade or so has focused on how to teach ethics to engineers. So we've not actually used any devices. That said, I also review and consult for our senior capstone design projects where the students are designing their own medical technologies and then testing them either on themselves or on their colleagues. And so I do some consulting and some advising around, does that study need an IRB review of your protocol, or is it simply device testing? So in the device world, you're right. similar to quality improvement of programs, something that's focused on non-generalizable data, it's local. When the students are trying to determine if a new device is working properly, they need to test it on a human. They're not trying to collect generalizable data here. They're just trying to see, does this actually work? Or does it work? How does it work? And can we make it better? Most of those are not considered research. But the research that I do in the classroom is often, it's been NSF, National Science Foundation funded research to try to develop generalizable protocols and pedagogy for better teaching models, particularly around ethics of engineering medical technologies, because we're trying to train biomedical engineers and those who develop medical technologies to think about them in more ethical ways. Does that help answer your question?
Oh yeah, no, I didn't mean to accuse you of using device research, but I guess it does sort of put a point on it, right? Like, well, first of all, I would say that Colin kind of raised this too. I mean, we are not we as ethicists, and we get called by the bioethics program of the CTSI. We're not IRB, so the ethics questions may still be there, right? If let's say a faculty member is, has some intellectual property, he's just doing local trialing on his students. I would think the same ethics issues would arise if they, coerce their students into letting him strap that thermometer on their arm, even though it's not officially researched, so the IRB is not involved. Do those issues come up for you? Do you ever feel like you have to give ethics advice which is not around IRB?
Rarely, but it is always a concern, just for that. I would say one of the most important things for any engineering department, but particularly biomedical engineering department, is to have a very comprehensive culture of safety. And so we do a lot of training. The students complain, like you said, they whine. We have them through all kinds of training. Staff go through all kinds of training. Faculty go through training, what's safe to do, what's safe to use. We as a department, I'm just giving you some details, indemnification, because we are reviewed by radiological environmental management and OSHA. And so all these safety constraints are in place in all of our laboratories and our classrooms. And we know that all it takes is one student to get harmed in some experiment. And guess what? The research is going to stop. So I think the general attitude is, if you think it's going to be too risky, don't do it, and find a way to do it that's safe. It's never been a problem in our school. It's always a consideration and a concern that needs to be addressed. And you point out rightly that those are ethical issues, safety issues, that influence research, but not it's usually in the development stage before it becomes a research protocol and goes to the IRB.
Great answer, Andrew. Thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I have the references to the citations. They're listed at the end of my slides, and also, again, citing the Center for Bioethics and the BSAP program. If you have additional questions about this and you want consultation, contact Nick, and he'll direct it to the right person to give feedback or consultations. This is a great service to any researchers that will help you.
I will make your slides and references available on our website when we upload this recording.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks again, Andrew. Great.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for the questions.